Good morning. I just wanted to start off today by thanking all of you for being here this morning, and thank you to the Decorative Arts Trust for inviting me to present. So my goal today, especially considering Jeff Groff's excellent lecture on the DuPont houses and gardens and their legacies, is to, as my title says, shine a light on some lesser-known architecture of Delaware's country house region. I've selected these historic sites because each embodies its own important history and about the Brandywine Valley and the country house culture. I've chosen 5 interesting places that I've researched as part of my ongoing work at the Center for Historic Architecture and Design, called CHAD, which is much easier to say, at the University of Delaware. And just a brief note about our work. Our projects range from the careful study of individual, largely vernacular buildings to the study of historic towns. We routinely write National Register of Historic Places nominations and now have authored 2 of the most recent National Historic Landmark nominations as well. And so just to get you familiar with the types of buildings I'm mostly comfortable in, it's the collapsing ones that you see on the screen. So I won't dive too deeply into the DuPont and country house architecture per se, since our Thursday night opening lecture covered some of this ground. But I do want to spend some time situating my stories in this landscape and historic context. As you all might have gathered through all of your field trip excursions this week, a very large swath of northern Delaware was dramatically reshaped by the DuPonts and their executives in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So as a brief background for those of you who might have missed the Thursday talk, the country house or country place movement in the United States emerged during the late 19th century and spanned the decades roughly between 1880 and 1940. During that period, the wealth of industrialists and corporate titans skyrocketed, but at the same time, the cities where their industries were typically located grew increasingly crowded, dirty, and noisy. To remove themselves from these environments, wealthy industrialists acquired large tracts of usually rural land and constructed sprawling country estates beyond metropolitan or even suburban areas. The creation of unprecedented amounts of wealth in the United States enabled the proliferation of country estate building. Country house historian Mark Hewitt has argued that, quote, "It is not difficult to explain the explosion in the number of country estates after 1890, since never before had so much capital been available to such a large number of Americans for the pursuit of leisure," end quote. Contemporary journalist Ferdinand Lundberg, in his 1937 book, America's 60 Families, argued that a plutocratic circle of families had emerged in the United States and declared that, quote, "No groups have ever been so wealthy as the Rockefeller, Ford, Harkness, Vanderbilt, Mellon, and DuPont families of America," end quote. For the individual families, the motivating factor for building country estates were largely social. Mark Hewitt has argued that, quote, "America's modern country estates can only be understood within the framework of the capitalist oligarchy and the institutions that ensured its exclusivity," end quote. To own a country house was to announce one's status among a new group of upper-class Americans, but it also allowed literal physical proximity to exclusive social enclaves and provided a stage set for the social and cultural rituals of high society. Social and recreational activities in country house enclaves often overlapped with and reflected a new cultural movement that emphasized nature, the countryside, and the outdoors. Driving forces behind the country house movement were reflected in back to nature movements and other cultural attachments to rural life, including scouting, nature clubs, city park movements, camp and resort compounds, and literary movements emphasizing the ideals of living with nature. Social and leisurely pursuits sometimes involve activities off the estate, such as sporting activities at nearby country clubs, which were proliferating at the time outside almost every sizable American city. Yet the acquisition of substantial land for country estates, beyond providing physical and social buffering, privacy, and status, also afforded a broad range of leisure activities that embraced the outdoors and nature. This usually represented a new use of the land, which in many cases was converted from farmland or other forms of economic production. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of the modern American country house was its association with leisure and social clubs and its dissociation from income-producing property. Indeed, most country houses were created to sustain facets of country life, including gentlemanly farming, breeding livestock, gardening, equestrian pursuits, hunting and fishing, sailing and yachting, and the modern sports of tennis and golf. Elaborate and extensive formal gardens, typically designed by well-known landscape architects, along with sunrooms, sun porches, and patio terraces, usually extended the house's living space into the outdoors, blurring the line between inside and outside. This connection to the outdoors was a key associative characteristic for country houses, even for contemporary observers, and outdoor activities were indeed a typical characteristic of most of the DuPont family country houses. Turning back to our country house story more locally, the DuPont family and their expanding chemical company played an enormous role in establishing country house culture in the Brandywine Valley of northern Delaware. And the family's estates almost single-handedly transformed much of the landscape in the region. As local historian Maggie Litz argues, quote, "No American family has dominated the industrial and residential architecture of a state longer than the DuPonts," end quote. Fully embracing the American country house movement, but also continuing the trend of country living established by the family patriarch and DuPont Company founder E.I. DuPont in 1802, the DuPont family set the cultural tone and geographic momentum in the 20th century with their large country estates and corporate developments northwest of the city of Wilmington. Though the DuPont family had a cluster of houses in the country in the early 19th century, centered on the powder works operation on the Brandywine and their ancestral home in America, Eleutherian Mills, the expansion and the visibility of the family's large houses mostly occurred after the Civil War as the family's size, wealth, and arguably their worldliness grew. During the 1870s and 1880s, a group of new, large DuPont family houses was built west of the Brandywine River on the Kennett Pike. By 1900, 14 family houses were located within a 3-mile radius of the powder yards. Within a few years, a new generation of DuPont leaders, 3 cousins named Alfred, T. Coleman, and Pierre Samuel, not only bought out the family company and revolutionized its management to create a modern 20th century corporation, but they also purchased real estate in the Brandywine River, Kennett Pike corridor, and built large estates. During World War I, as the sale of gunpowder propelled the DuPont Company to entirely new levels of success, this landscape of Wilmington was a landscape of largely DuPont family estates. Estate building for the DuPont family did not slow during the Great Depression. By 1942, DuPont family members had at least 70 country houses of 20 acres or more in the Brandywine Valley. DuPont family estates, especially when combined with the estates of DuPont Company executives, comprised a large percentage of the country houses mapped on the screen. Notably, during the second half of the 20th century, many of the DuPont estates would be converted into public lands, museum institutions, or simply broken up and subdivided after World War II. So with all that background and history in mind, I'm going to switch gears now to discuss some of the lesser-known architectures associated with Delaware's country house landscapes or their owners at 5 different sites. So where did the DuPont wealth come from? So as you all know from your field trip this week, it was from gunpowder, manufactured nearby at what is now known as the Hagley Museum and Library. And the gunpowder operation could not have been created without the use of water power and the historic dams that diverted water into the gunpowder operation. In France, E.I. DuPont, founder of what became the DuPont Company, studied gunpowder manufacturing, and by 1802, he would import similar processes to the United States on the Brandywine River, including new ideas for the design of mill structures, the arrangement of the buildings, and the processes used to create the gunpowder. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, the DuPont family emigrated from France in 1800 and soon began scouting locations to build a gunpowder works in the United States. In 1802, after visiting Wilmington, Delaware, E.I. DuPont decided to site his manufactory north of the city along the Brandywine River. He purchased 95 acres of land, which included a dam and a race, plus a cotton and sawmill. DuPont then began constructing the Eleutherian Mills mansion and his powder yard. DuPont continued to expand his land holdings, buying additional acreage along the Brandywine, mostly south of this first mill site. So when DuPont acquired the Brandywine River property for the construction of his powder works, he built a new dam, determining that the old dam and race would be unable to supply a sufficient amount of water power for his needs, with the dam too far removed from the site of the powder mills and the race providing too little water and being too shallow. While perhaps not the most architecturally exciting of the stories I will share with you today, the Eleutherian Mill Dam serves as an architectural reminder of the industry that propelled the later construction of the country houses. The dam itself was constructed of local Brandywine blue gneiss, perhaps even quarried on the property, as Hagley is full of naturally occurring fieldstone. These low-head mill dams on the Brandywine, individually and together, signify a story of 18th and 19th century water-powered industries along the river. During the years after the American Revolution, there was a dizzying explosion of industry on the Brandywine, and by 1793, there were 50 merchant mills, 50 sawmills, 8 forges, 7 fulling mills, 4 grist mills, 4 paper mills, 3 oil mills, 2 silting mills, and 1 snuff mill. DuPont added his own mills to this heavily industrialized Brandywine beginning in 1802. By 1816, the Brandywine between Rockland, Delaware and Wilmington, Delaware could boast of at least 13 mill dams powering no less than 86 mills, many of substantial size and output. In most cases, these last remaining mill dams, of which 10 survive today, are all that is left to reflect the Brandywine region's industrial heritage. As I mentioned earlier, part of the country house movement included shaping landscapes as well as pursuing leisure activities. In addition to collecting American antiques, Henry Francis DuPont, who founded the Winneter Museum, also had a passion for breeding and raising dairy cows. The dairy complex at Winneter is arguably the best and grandest example of dairy architecture in the state. The purpose-built complex was constructed in 1916 to house DuPont's world-renowned Holstein herd, and while in operation, Winneter Farms, as the milk was sold under, was one of the largest dairies on the East Coast. These buildings collectively represent scientific dairy farming, led by wealthy industrialists, new governmental sanitary regulations for the dairy industry, progressive design theories, and the emergence of new architectural materials from the early 20th century. Since the formation of Winneter in the early 19th century, dairying had always been existed on the estate in some form. However, the intensified focus on scientific farming, and later especially on dairy farming, was due to the efforts of Colonel Henry Algernon DuPont and then his son Henry Francis DuPont. After retiring in 1899, Colonel DuPont turned his attentions to actively developing Winneter Farms into a thriving farming operation. However, the real shift to the world-renowned dairy operation occurred in 1914 when HF took over the management of the farm. His goal was to develop a better and perhaps a more perfect breed of Holstein cows. To do this, he undertook an extensive campaign to breed the cattle. He went all the way to Minnesota to secure what he deemed as the best Holsteins, which he selected due to their size, type, and of course, level of milk production. Committed to scientific management of his herd, DuPont constructed a state-of-the-art dairy complex on his estate. DuPont hired Elmer Humphreys, a barn designer from New York, to oversee the construction of the entire project. Together, these two men constructed a dairy barn, which was roughly 300 feet by 40 feet. The original barn had burned down. This is a second barn that was built on the estate, with 152 stanchions and 12 box stalls that had 3 large silos attached. Also constructed at the time was a 130 cow calf barn, a heifer barn, a bull barn, and a creamery that could process 10,000 pounds of milk per day. At the height of operation, the Winneter herd ranged from 420 to 450 Holsteins, and if you're not in the dairy business, that was a lot of cows back then. So following DuPont's death in 1969, per his will, the Winneter herd was sold off at auction, ending the over 50 years of intensive dairy farming on the estate. So just a half mile from the entrance of Winneter, a little-known DuPont family country estate called Davenport holds many interesting stories. So constructed between 1932 and 1933, Davenport is a colonial revival-style country house designed by a female architectural designer, Mary McLaughlin Craig, as a replica of George Washington's Mount Vernon, which is the most reproduced historical building in America. Commissioned by industrial heiress and philanthropist Amy E. DuPont as her country place near Wilmington, it is a late expression of the American country house movement and one of the last DuPont family country houses constructed during this era. Davenport is characteristically designed for entertaining, with large, highly ornamented formal rooms, domestic service spaces, and recreational and garden-related features, including a large in-ground swimming pool, expansive lawns, and a terraced side yard with ornamental plantings. Designed by Mary McLaughlin Craig, one of the most prominent architectural designers during the 1920s and 1930s in Santa Barbara, California, and at a time when there were relatively few women architects practicing in the United States, Davenport represents Craig's only known commission in Delaware and is the only known architectural collaboration between a female patron and a female architect for a country house in the Brandywine Valley. Built during a period of renewed colonial revival fervor surrounding the bicentennial birthday of George Washington, Davenport is representative of a national architectural trend reproducing Mount Vernon-inspired buildings that first emerged at the turn of the 20th century. Constructed during the height of the trend's popularity, Davenport retains key features associated with Mount Vernon, reflecting it as a design inspiration, including its three-part form, two-story piazzas, gabled dormers, brick-end chimney walls on the main block, and the prominent roof cupola, the last of which was added in the 1950s during renovations by later owners. So between Davenport and the city of Wilmington, we can see an interesting example of how the country place movement manifested itself as subdivisions. At Westover Hills, as the American country house era was about to come to an end with the Great Depression, William DuPont transformed an old family property into a suburban subdivision filled with mini country houses. When talking about places like Westover Hills, our consideration of the country house movement can be expanded to include not only the grand estates that were typically called country houses, but also the smaller suburban-type houses that channeled its spirits and influence. The suburban neighborhoods flanking Kennett Pike, northwest of Wilmington, and even some city neighborhoods along the same thoroughfare clearly reflected country house characteristics. The architecture and the landscapes in these neighborhoods, some essentially suburbs in the city, seem to mimic the architecture and aura of the Brandywine countryside, employing park views, curved linear roads, wide boulevards, ample lots, deep setbacks, formal gardens, and period houses with revival-style architecture. There was thus no clear architectural boundary between city, suburb, or countryside on the northwest side of Wilmington. However, scholars of the country house movement have largely ignored the smaller versions of country homes in the adjacent suburban districts, and especially those associated within the city, even when they feature all of the defining characteristics of country houses except the expansive acreage. Yet, it is clear that many of these fashionable houses were considered country houses at the time. As such, our current use of the term country house fails to take into account the full breadth and complexity of that movement's influence, including houses like this on the screen. So the nearly imperceptible transition from urban to rural country houses in Wilmington was in many ways the mark of the DuPonts and their company. The spectrum of country house types in Wilmington, built in an array of sizes and context, is heavily clustered along the Kennett Pike corridor northwest of the city. The exclusive subdivision at Westover Hills, located on the west side of Kennett Pike, was developed in the 1920s during the last phase of the country house movement, and represents an interesting intermediary between both physically and conceptually between the true country estates to the north and the city houses that were influenced by them to the south. Developed by William DuPont on a 600-acre land inherited from his grandfather, Westover Hills importantly bordered the Wilmington Country Club. Nearly $500,000 were invested in the early preparation efforts for Westover Hills. The subdivision process for this exclusive enclave of miniature estates was driven by the Delaware Land Department Company, controlled by William DuPont and other family members. Initially, only a 57-acre portion of the 600-acre tract was developed, ensuring that all of the first homes would be adjacent to the country club, a move calculated to be a demonstration of the class of the property it was to be. Marketed as Wilmington's first restricted suburban residential district for high-class real estate and located in the best rural residential section in the region, the exclusive status for the development was closely controlled through its aesthetics. A committee would carefully monitor proposed architectural designs, ensuring each property met rigid requirements, while the developers from the beginning restricted any business establishments, duplexes, or apartments to provide proper protection against depreciating influences. The developers clearly encouraged architecture in the historical revival styles of the era. The president of the development company declared early on to a reporter that it is expected that English architecture will be generally followed. Exclusivity in Westover Hills was achieved not just through architectural requirements and a country feel alone, but also through steep pricing. Empty building lots were initially offered, as one newspaper put it, at fancy prices, with a price range from $4,000 to $20,000 per lot. Lots varied in size, but every house would be built on a parcel totaling almost an acre of ground. By 1929, one historian suggests Delaware was home to an estimated 68 millionaires, and many of them called this exclusive subdivision home. So lastly, to bring us back into the city of Wilmington, I wanted to highlight how the country house movement, as odd as it sounds, manifested itself in the creation of city estates. A few years before Westover Hills was developed, this Cool Spring neighborhood was developed in a much different manner. Located significantly closer to the city center than Westover Hills, on a hill built with a long view, Cool Springs was a former farm that was gradually subdivided and sold off. The development was not professionally planned, and builders there honored the gridded city street system originally plotted on city maps. In 1914, a vice president at DuPont, Frank Tallman, purchased a lot at the corner of Broome and 10th Streets and built a Grand Tudor Revival house, which he christened Mauchline. Now obscured by trees and crowded on-street parking, the house once enjoyed a more open setting and an expansive view. Designed by a leader in the country life movement, Wilson Eyre, the estate was elaborate yet compact, and was featured in the Architectural Record magazine in 1918. Recently, a landscape conservationist who did a report about Mauchline's gardens himself mused that the architect seems to have somehow fit a large estate into a city lot. Across the street, just a couple years later, H. Fletcher Brown, another DuPont company VP, and his wife Florence built perhaps the most striking example of an urban country house in Wilmington. It was designed by Charles Barton Keene, an architect who has been called one of the most prolific designers of country houses in the United States. Keene, a resident of Philadelphia, designed many of the country houses on Philadelphia's main line and is best known for designing Rinalda, which you can see on the screen. Emulating the common tactic to create country estates, purchasing multiple adjacent properties to assemble a large estate, the Browns executed this strategy in miniature, acquiring several parcels to assemble a large city estate that covered 2/3 of their city block. Before the Ingleside residential tower blocked its view, the Brown mansion enjoyed a sweeping panorama over Cool Springs Reservoir and Park, and probably downtown Wilmington in the distance. The Browns crafted elaborate formal gardens at their sloping city lot. The Browns and their neighbors, the Tallmans at Mauchline, had clearly established miniature country estates in a gridded city neighborhood. They were products of the same country house movement as the larger Brandywine country estates built by their friends and colleagues at the DuPont Company. So there is some element of preservation or architectural history work at all of these places. Some were or are under some kind of threat, which is often why we at the center get involved. For instance, for the last 5 years or so, a group of people have been trying to remove the 10 remaining mill dams along the Brandywine River for a variety of reasons that I won't get into today. As part of a project, we were hired to study the historic significance of all of them as a collective to better understand their history and importance to the region. Similarly, at the H. Fletcher Brown Mansion, we were hired to complete architectural documentation at the site as part of a mitigation project, as Ingleside, the retirement community who owns the building today, was altering the historic fabric of the building while using federal funding. The rest of the sites discussed, Chad worked on for one of two reasons. The first was to nominate them to the National Register of Historic Places, which was why we undertook work at Hagley and Davenport, or the sites were researched by my center as part of the upcoming Vernacular Architecture Forum's annual conference here in Wilmington, which will be held in 2 weeks in May. So these types of stories and the types of historic resources I highlighted here today briefly help us better understand the broader context of the country house movement in the Brandywine Valley, and all of these somewhat ancillary seeming sites embody their own significant part of this history. Thank you.